The housing crash is here, the recession is getting worse, but the 10 cities on this list will not experience a big decline in home prices. That's because they have a unique combination of affordability, low inventory, and long-term price stability. If you're a home buyer in these cities, you can buy with more confidence that your down payment is not going to get wiped out. And if you're an investor, these markets offer higher returns for rentals. Starting with our number 10 housing market that's not going to crash, Oklahoma City. You can see Oklahoma City was one of the rare housing markets where prices actually went up from 2007 to 2012 during the worst housing crash of all time. Oklahoma City is an affordable housing market. That's why it dodged the last crash. That's why it's going to dodge this crash, because you can still buy a nice house in a good school district across the Oklahoma City metro for less than $270,000. And it's a similar situation in our number 9 housing market that won't crash. This is an area moving up into the Midwest, which is a more historically stable real estate market. Specifically, we're in southern Ohio here with Cincinnati, a market where the typical home buyer spends about $1,700 a month for their mortgage, interest, property taxes, and insurance. Now, that house payment is up from what it was historically. However, it's still less than 30% of the median income across Cincinnati, indicating that locals can still afford the houses even at 6.4% mortgage rates. And the result is very low inventory levels, with the for sale inventory on the market in Cincinnati declining from 5,000 homes before the pandemic to only 1,600 homes in early 2023. Those low inventory levels are going to keep prices supported in Cincinnati over the next 6 to 9 months. Moving on to our number 8 housing market that's not going to crash and that presents home buyers and investors with some stability and affordability in 2023 is Virginia Beach, Virginia. Now, Virginia Beach is a very interesting housing market. This is one that runs off the military. About 40% of the mortgages originated in Virginia Beach in 2022 were VA loans. And that dependency on the military means it's not as prone to big booms. It doesn't have as much long-term price appreciation, but that also means it's not as prone to big busts. You can see this evidence in the metric that I developed called over-undervalued percentage. Virginia Beach housing market right now is only 11% overvalued compared to long-term historical fundamentals. That's one of the least overvalued housing markets in America. For comparison, Atlanta's 32% overvalued and Nashville's 34% overvalued. Now, before revealing number 7 and number 6 on this list, I need to address a point that I think a lot of you guys are thinking already. You're probably thinking, wait a minute, Oklahoma City, Cincinnati, and Virginia Beach, these aren't the sexiest housing markets or cities. These are not necessarily the ones at the top of the list to move to every year. And that's actually good, folks. In a recession and in a housing market, if you are buying a house, you want to buy in a city that's not as popular, is not as sexy. History shows those are the ones that are going to withstand the crash better. Alternatively, it's going to be the boom towns during the pandemic that crashed the most. And I know you guys know these cities: Austin, Salt Lake, Phoenix, Vegas, Nashville, Tampa, Miami. These are going to be the ones that have the biggest declines in prices going forward, because quite simply, the locals in those cities cannot afford the houses, and that becomes a big problem in a recession, especially when the migration train slows down as it is now. And the reason I like the number 7 city on this list that won't have a housing crash is because it's not overly reliant on huge amounts of people moving in. There wasn't a massive migration spike, and as a result, the home buying demand in Little Rock, Arkansas is much more evenly and fundamentally supported going forward. For instance, the typical home value in Little Rock is $189,000 according to Zillow, which you can see is basically half of the typical home value in Dallas and almost 1/3 of the typical home value in Austin. And I'm not saying Little Rock is better than Dallas and Austin. Clearly it's not. There's a reason the prices are cheaper, but affordability is becoming a major draw for certain cities here in 2023, with the housing crash starting, with the recession, with Americans dealing with 2+ years of inflation and not having much money. If you want to buy a house and you want to buy it fast, sometimes maybe it's good to look outside of the box into a city you haven't considered. Now, for our number 6 housing market that's not going to crash, we're going to move geographies. We're going to move away from the south and actually move up to the northeast in America. This is a city that not a lot of people think about in terms of being a tight housing market and home prices going up, but it's actually the hottest housing market in America right now. Where am I talking about? That would be Hartford, Connecticut. And to see what I'm talking about, take a look at this map where we're tracking the growth in inventory year over year on the US housing market. And you can see most of these areas in red have big increases in inventory. Like Dallas has a 172% increase in homes for sale year over year. But what about Hartford? Hartford. Inventory in Hartford is actually down 17% year over year. We can see there's only 750 homes on the market in Hartford today compared to 4,000 a couple years ago before the pandemic. So inventory in Hartford is down 75%. Now that's astounding, everyone, because when I say Hartford, you probably think of like, that place sucks. People are leaving. All the insurance companies have left central Connecticut. How is it possible then that Hartford's the hottest housing market in America with the lowest amount of inventory? Well, one big reason is they just simply don't build any homes there. This graph tracks building permits in the Hartford, Connecticut metro going back the last 30 years. And what do you notice, folks? They were building about 4,000 homes a year in the mid-2000s, and then bam, during the last housing crash, the permitting collapsed, and it has never recovered. And so with so little building in Hartford and much of the Northeast, that's leading to constrained inventory levels, even though these cities are still losing people. And one thing you need to understand if you're a home buyer and investor who wants to understand where prices are going to go, understand this: migration and people moving into a city really doesn't matter that much for home prices. And I know that sounds crazy because conventional wisdom says the more people that are moving to a city, the more the prices are going to go up. But when you actually look at the data on inventory right now, that's not true. It's the exact opposite. And when you look at the long-term data on the housing market, you also see it's not true. Because if we compare migration over the last 22 years to home value growth over the last 22 years in the largest counties in America, what do you notice? There's a minimal relationship, R squared of 0.06, which is basically non-existent. And to be clear, what this graph is showing is that the appreciation rates long-term are the same in counties that people leave as they are in counties that people move to. And why is that? Home building, everyone. Home builders aren't totally stupid. Home builders build in the areas that people are moving to, and as a result, there isn't really a long-term advantage to being a high migration market. So while you chew on that for a little while, folks, let's get to our number 5 housing market that won't crash. This is going to be a controversial one. I know a lot of you are going to wince when I say this city, but it's one that I truly believe is going to do better than average in this housing downturn. That city would be El Paso, Texas. El Paso is a housing market where prices are still very affordable. The typical value is less than $200,000, which means you can buy a 3-bed, 2-bath house, which was built about 20 years ago for $160,000, and your payment would be only $1,000 a month. El Paso is also another one of these cities that did not really crash in the 2008 bust. You can see values peaked in El Paso at $131,000 in 2008, and they went down to about $116K at the bottom in 2013. So they went down about 12 to 13% in the last downturn, and they've had another run up this time, and I suspect the downturn in El Paso is going to look similar again, where we're going to see an incremental decline over the next 4 or 5 years, but no big crash. Now, I don't expect many of you to want to move to El Paso and buy a house. However, I do think if you're an investor looking for a new market to buy a rental, you should consider it. El Paso actually has one of the highest cap rates in America at 7.3%. You can get around $15,000 net income on a $200,000 house. Compare that to a place like Phoenix, where the cap rate is only 5.1%. Moving on to our number 4 housing market that won't crash. This is completely different than El Paso, totally different part of the country. We are moving back up to the Midwest. This is a city that also did really well, relatively speaking, in the 2008 downturn. Home prices in Pittsburgh actually increased by 5% during the worst housing crash of all time from 2007 to 2012. I mean, think about that, folks. While prices in Phoenix went down 53%, and while prices in Miami went down 52%, values in Pittsburgh were going up. And that's because Pittsburgh is a stable market. The prices never really boomed too much. The local wages allow people to afford the monthly payments. Pittsburgh is also another metro similar to Hartford where there just isn't any home building. On this graph, you can take a look at permitting in the Pittsburgh metro over the last 30 years. Historically, in the 90s and 2000s, they were permitting 7,000 homes a year. And then in the end of 2022, they only permitted 4,000 homes. It was up a bit from before the pandemic, but this is still a very low level of building. And so you're not going to see these big sprawling new home building suburbs in Pittsburgh with empty houses. The builders just ignore this metro area, and as a result, it's less inclined for a crash. As is our number 3 housing market that won't hit a downturn. Get ready, folks. Our number 2 and our number 1 are coming, but we got to talk about number 3 first. This is actually a city. I'm not quite sure if it's in the Midwest or the Southeast. You can let me know in the comments section below. I actually visited this city over the weekend, and I noticed how the home prices are relatively affordable here. In our number 3 market that won't crash, Louisville, Kentucky, the typical price, according to Zillow, is $236,000, which is up from what it was historically. But when you use Revenutre app to compare home value to income, you can see the median incomes in Louisville have also gone up in a similar way, which means locals can still afford the houses, which is going to support the housing market in Louisville even as this housing crash unfolds. Moving on to our number 2 housing market that won't crash. This is a very interesting one. It's a state capital. It has more stable employment historically, and as a result, I don't expect prices to go down much in Richmond, Virginia. And the story in Richmond's housing market right now is a total lack of inventory. If we look on Revenutre app, we can see there's only 1,500 homes for sale in Richmond here in 2023. That's only a slight improvement from what it was in 2022 and still half of what it was before the pandemic. And this low inventory is leading to still lots of bidding wars in the Richmond housing market. You know, a house like this priced at $495,000 in a nice neighborhood. In just 3 hours on Zillow, it already has 570 views and 47 saves. And so while I think Richmond will have a correction as this housing crash unfolds, maybe 10 to 15%, it's not going to have a crash. Now, before getting to our number 1 housing market that won't crash, I just want to let you guys know how you can look up a lot of the data in this video for yourself. Go to www.revenutre.app and you can see metrics like how much home prices crashed in your city from 2007 to 2012. You can look at how overvalued housing markets are. You can see demographic information like population and income. You can track inventory and home value data. And you can even look at all this data by zip code so you can understand all these trends in your neighborhood. And using Revenutre app allowed me to compile this list and actually get to our number 1 city that won't have a housing crash during this downturn. This is a city that generally avoids housing crashes. It didn't go into a big bust in 2007, 2012. It didn't go into a big bust in the early 90s. This place has a steady employment base. There's not a lot of people moving in, but not a lot of people moving out. Prices are still fairly cheap. Where am I talking? That would be Albany, New York. Using Revenutre app, we can see Albany is only 8% overvalued. The typical home price there is $290,000 today, while the fair home value based on incomes in the metro is $267,000. This relative affordability and fairer values has led to a complete collapse in inventory in Albany, where there's only 926 homes on the market compared to 3,400 before the pandemic. Fun fact, I was also born in Albany, but I promise that did not bias my ranking. The data really says that it's still a tight housing market where locals can afford the homes. And once again, make sure to go to www.revenutre.app if you want to access this data for yourself.